The rusted padlock had been there for 75 years, weathered by mountain storms and guarded by silence. Jake Morrison stood before his grandfather's cabin in the Colorado Rockies, bolt cutters heavy in his trembling hands. 3 generations of his family had walked past this door without ever asking why it remained sealed since 1948. But Jake wasn't like the others. As a former Army intelligence officer, he recognized the signs: the reinforced steel beneath rotting wood, the radiation detection equipment hidden in the foundation, the way local wildlife avoided this particular ridge. His grandfather hadn't just locked this cabin, he'd fortified it. The inheritance letter had been specific: open only when you're ready to learn what we really brought back from Germany. Now, as Jake cut through the final chain, a low humming sound emerged from within. Electronic, purposeful, and very much alive. Something had been waiting in there for decades, powered by an unknown source. The door creaked open, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. But what made Jake's blood freeze wasn't what he couldn't see. It was the fresh footprints in the dust leading deeper inside. What had his grandfather been hiding all these years that required a 75-year quarantine? Jake steadied his breathing, muscle memory from his military training kicking in. He drew his sidearm. Old habits died hard, and stepped across the threshold. The air inside tasted metallic, charged with an electricity that made his teeth ache. His flashlight beam swept across walls, lined with what appeared to be lead sheeting, barely visible beneath layers of accumulated grime. The footprints were definitely recent. Size 11 boots, military-style treads, leading straight down a narrow hallway that shouldn't exist in a cabin this small. From the outside, the structure looked like a simple one-room hunting lodge. Yet here he stood in what felt like a corridor extending impossibly deep into the mountain itself. The humming grew louder as he advanced, joined by an occasional clicking sound, like a Geiger counter detecting radiation. Jake's grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had been a demolitions expert in World War II, part of a classified unit that had swept through Germany in the war's final weeks. The old man had returned home in late 1947, immediately purchased this remote property, built the cabin, and sealed it shut. He'd lived another 40 years without ever mentioning what lay behind that door. Jake paused at a junction where the hallway split in 2 directions. The fresh footprints continued straight, but something about the left passage caught his attention. His flashlight illuminated a series of photographs mounted on the corridor wall, black and white images of men in military uniforms, some wearing gas masks, others in what looked like hazmat suits, decades before such equipment was commonplace. In the center hung a photograph of his grandfather, looking impossibly young, standing beside a massive metallic object partially excavated from rubble. The caption beneath, written in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, read, "Schwarzwald Facility, March 1947. God help us all." A sound echoed from deeper in the complex, the unmistakable scrape of metal on stone. Someone else was definitely down here, and they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Jake clicked off his flashlight and pressed himself against the lead-lined wall, listening. Footsteps approached from the direction the fresh prints had taken, measured and deliberate. Through the darkness, a voice called out, gravelly and aged, but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Jacob Morrison. "I've been waiting 75 years for you to open that door." Jake's blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew he was coming here. He hadn't told anyone about the inheritance, hadn't mentioned the letter or the keys his grandfather's lawyer had given him. Yet somehow, this stranger knew exactly who he was. "Your grandfather was a good soldier," the voice continued, drawing closer. "But he made a mistake thinking he could contain what we found in Germany. Some discoveries refuse to stay buried, boy. Some secrets demand to be shared." Light began to emanate from around the corner. Not electric light, but something else, something that seemed to pulse with its own organic rhythm. The humming intensified, joined by sounds that made Jake's skin crawl, a wet, sliding noise like something massive dragging itself across stone. He gripped his weapon tighter, though a growing certainty told him that bullets would be useless against whatever his grandfather had hidden in this mountain. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch him in the strange, fluctuating light, the faces of long-dead soldiers bearing expressions of horror and fascination. "Come now, Jacob," the voice called, almost gentle. "Don't you want to know what your family legacy really is? What we've been protecting and protecting the world from all these decades?" Jake realized he had a choice to make. He could retreat, reseal the cabin, and pretend this moment had never happened. Or he could step forward into the pulsing light and finally learn the truth about what Thomas Morrison had brought back from the ruins of Nazi Germany. The humming reached a crescendo, and Jake Morrison made his choice. The drive up the mountain took 3 hours longer than Jake had expected. What the lawyer had generously called a road was little more than a dirt track that snaked through dense pine forests, climbing steadily into terrain that seemed untouched by the last 70 years. His Honda Civic wasn't built for this kind of punishment, and twice he'd had to stop to move fallen branches that blocked his path. By the time he reached the coordinates scrawled on the back of his grandfather's deed, the afternoon sun was already casting long shadows between the trees. Jake killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring through his windshield at what had once been his grandfather's retreat. The cabin squatted in a small clearing like a wooden tumor, dark and somehow malevolent despite the cheerful late-spring sunshine filtering through the canopy above. It was larger than he'd imagined. 2 stories of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that jutted toward the sky like an accusing finger. The windows were boarded up with planks that had weathered to silver grey, and the front door was crossed with thick wooden beams secured by heavy iron bolts that looked like they belonged on a medieval castle. Jake stepped out of the car, his sneakers crunching on pine needles and decades of accumulated forest debris. The silence was absolute except for the soft whisper of wind through the trees. No birds sang. Even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He approached the front door, noting how the wooden barriers weren't just nailed in place, they were secured with serious hardware, industrial screws, reinforced brackets, and what looked like military-grade padlocks. Someone had wanted to make very sure this place stayed sealed. The key ring the lawyer had given him contained 6 keys of various sizes and vintages. The largest was an ornate brass skeleton key that looked antique even by 1948 standards. It fit into the first padlock with a satisfying click, though the mechanism was so corroded Jake had to use both hands and considerable force to turn it. As each lock came free, Jake found himself growing more uneasy. The silence around the cabin seemed to deepen with each metallic click. By the time he was working on the final beam across the door, his hands were trembling slightly, though whether from exertion or nerves he couldn't say. The last barrier fell away with a heavy thud that echoed off the surrounding trees. Jake stood before the front door, thick oak planks bound with iron hinges that had somehow resisted 7 decades of mountain weather. There was no lock on the door itself, just a simple latch that lifted with the barest pressure from his thumb. The door swung open on hinges that shrieked like something in pain. The smell hit him immediately. Not the mustiness he'd expected from a long-sealed building, but something else entirely, something organic and wrong that made his stomach clench. It was faint but unmistakable, like meat that had been left too long in a warm place, though that was impossible after all these years. Jake fumbled for his phone's flashlight and stepped across the threshold. The beam illuminated a front room that looked frozen in time. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left, covered in canvas tarps that had somehow remained intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with what appeared to be the remnants of hastily burned papers. The wooden floor was covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no signs of disturbance. No animal tracks, no fallen debris from the ceiling above. But it was what hung on the walls that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every available surface. Black and white images in cheap frames, tacked directly to the log walls, overlapping each other in a collage that seemed to pulse in the shifting light of his phone. Jake moved closer, the floorboards creaking ominously under his feet. The photos were military in nature, soldiers in uniform, group shots of men standing beside trucks and equipment he didn't recognize. Some appeared to be documentation photos of locations, remote buildings, mountain installations, what looked like concrete bunkers built into cliffsides. And in many of the photos, Jake recognized his grandfather's face. But this wasn't the gentle old man who had taught him to fish and told him stories about the good war. This was a younger, harder version of his grandfather, wearing a uniform Jake didn't recognize and standing among men whose eyes seemed to hold secrets too dark for daylight. But it was the final wall that made Jake's knees go weak. These photos weren't of places or people. They were documentation of something else entirely, images that his mind struggled to process, showing shapes and forms that didn't seem to follow any natural law. Dark masses that might have been organic tissue, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of it all, a single photograph larger than the rest, showing his grandfather standing beside what appeared to be an open doorway carved into living rock. The expression on his grandfather's face was one of barely controlled terror. Someone had written across the bottom of the photo in his grandfather's careful handwriting, "Some doors should never be opened." The lock yielded with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting 75 years for the right touch. Jake's hands trembled as he worked the heavy bolt free from its housing, the metal groaning in protest. When the final mechanism clicked open, he stepped back, heart hammering against his ribs. The door swung inward on silent hinges, releasing a gust of stale air that carried scents he couldn't identify. Leather, metal, and something else. Something organic and wrong. Jake fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through absolute darkness. The first thing he noticed was how pristine everything looked, as if time had simply stopped in 1948. A heavy wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, maps, and what appeared to be photographs. Along the walls, military equipment hung in precise rows, uniforms, packs, and items he didn't recognize. He stepped across the threshold, floorboards creaking under his weight. The beams swept left, revealing shelves lined with glass jars. His breath caught as the light illuminated their contents. Specimens. Each jar held something suspended in murky liquid. At first glance, they looked like biological samples, tissue maybe, or small organs. But as Jake moved closer, his stomach lurched. The shapes were wrong, twisted into configurations that shouldn't exist in nature. One jar contained what might have been fingers, except they branched like coral. Another held a mass of flesh pierced by structures that resembled tiny antlers. "What the hell, Grandpa?" Jake whispered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. He forced himself away from the specimens and toward the table. The papers were yellowed but legible, covered in his grandfather's precise handwriting. Most were in English, but scattered throughout were notes in what looked like German, Russian, and languages he couldn't identify. The photographs made his skin crawl. Black and white images showed military personnel in winter gear, posed in front of what appeared to be excavation sites. But these weren't ordinary archaeological digs. The holes in the ground were massive, perfectly circular, and so deep the camera's flash couldn't penetrate the darkness within. In several photos, Jake could make out wooden scaffolding descending into the pits, with cables and pulleys, suggesting they'd hauled something up from below. One photograph stopped him cold. His grandfather stood among a group of soldiers, but Charles Morrison looked different. Younger, yes, but also haunted in a way Jake had never seen. The old man's eyes in the photo held a terror that seemed to leap across the decades. Scrawled across the bottom of the image in fading ink, Hollow Earth Project, Site 7, December 1947. Jake's hands shook as he set the photograph down and reached for a leather-bound journal beneath the scattered papers. The moment he opened it, his grandfather's voice seemed to echo from the pages. December 15, 1947. The things we've brought up from the deep places should have been left alone. Morrison says we're making history, but I think we're making monsters. The specimens are still alive even after removal. They change when exposed to surface conditions. God help us, they're trying to communicate. December 18th, 1947. Lost Henderson today. He was examining sample 23 when it reacted. The medics say his body is intact, but his mind is gone. He just stands there staring at nothing, making sounds no human throat should produce. Sometimes I catch him looking at the rest of us like he's hungry. December 23rd, 1947. We've sealed the dig sites, but it's too late. The infection is spreading through the unit. Morrison won't listen. He says the mission is too important, that the technology down there could change the world. He's right, but not the way he thinks. Jake flipped through more entries, each more disturbing than the last. His grandfather wrote about soldiers developing strange abilities, about whispers in the dark that came from beneath the earth, about orders from Washington to bring back assets at any cost. The final entry was dated December 31st, 1947. I'm the only one left who remembers being human. The others, they wear faces I recognize, but they're not the men I served with anymore. I've taken what samples I could and I'm leaving this God-forsaken place. May God forgive me for what we've unleashed. If anyone finds this record, burn it. Burn everything. Some knowledge is too dangerous for the world. A soft thud from somewhere in the cabin made Jake's blood freeze. He snapped the journal shut, ears straining. Another sound, definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the kitchen. But that was impossible. He'd locked the front door behind him, and there were no other entrances. Unless... Jake's eyes darted to the specimens on the shelves. In the shifting light of his phone, did that one jar look empty? He was sure it had contained something before, a twisted mass of tissue that had pressed against the glass like it was trying to escape. The footsteps stopped directly outside the hidden room. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the open doorway, waiting in the darkness. The morning light filtering through the dusty windows revealed details that the flashlight had missed. Jake stood in the cabin's main room, coffee mug in hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The newspapers weren't just stacked. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, creating a timeline that spiraled outward from the center of the room like some obsessive historian's project. He knelt beside the nearest stack, careful not to disturb the arrangement. The headlines made his skin crawl. Mass disappearances baffle authorities. Entire village vanishes overnight. Military investigation ongoing. All dated between 1947 and 1948, all from different countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made his hands shake. His grandfather's neat script filled every available space. Witnesses report strange lights, no bodies found, soil samples anomalous. The words were connected by thin pencil lines, creating a web of connections that Jake couldn't begin to understand. A leather portfolio lay open beneath yesterday's newspaper, revealing dozens of black and white photographs. Jake picked one up with trembling fingers. The image showed what appeared to be a crater, but the edges were too clean, too geometric. Buildings surrounding it had been sheared off at impossible angles, their remains scattered like broken toys. He flipped to the next photo and immediately wished he hadn't. A line of soldiers stood at attention, but their faces were wrong, features blurred and distorted as if the camera had moved, except everything else in the image was perfectly sharp. Jake squinted at the uniforms, recognizing his grandfather's unit insignia from old family photos. The third photograph made him drop the entire stack. Bodies lay in neat rows, but they weren't casualties of war. They were pristine, unmarked, their expressions peaceful. What terrified Jake wasn't their condition, it was that he recognized the landscape behind them. The distinctive pine trees and rocky outcropping were visible from this very cabin's front porch. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, scrambling backward until he hit the wall. His grandfather's journal lay open on a makeshift desk, constructed from ammunition crates. Jake approached it like it might bite him, but curiosity won over fear. The entries began normally enough. routine military observations about weather and supply lines. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. March 15, 1948, the lights appeared again last night, third time this week. Henderson says they're flares, but flares don't move like that. They don't pulse with that rhythm. March 18, 1948, found the first group this morning. 23 civilians arranged in perfect formation. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Dr. Vance says they've been dead for hours, but they're still warm. March 22, 1948. It's not random. The pattern is becoming clear. The lights always appear 3 days before, always in groups of prime numbers. Command doesn't want to hear it, but the math doesn't lie. Jake's coffee had gone cold in his hands as he read. His grandfather's handwriting became increasingly erratic with each entry, the careful military precision degrading into desperate scrawls. March 30th, 1948. They're not from here. I know how that sounds, but I've seen what they can do, the way space bends around them, the way time seems to skip. Morrison walked into one of their fields yesterday. When he came out, he was speaking a language that doesn't exist. April 2nd, 1948. Command is pulling us out. They say the mission is classified beyond our clearance level. They're bringing in specialists, people with advanced degrees and security clearances I've never heard of. We're to return home and never speak of what we've seen. April 5th, 1948. Last entry before departure. I've taken precautions. If something happens to me, if they decide I know too much, the evidence is here. The cabin is prepared. Sarah thinks I'm building a hunting lodge, but I'm building a vault. Some secrets are too dangerous for the world, but too important to forget. Jake turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank. He flipped through dozens of empty pages before finding a single line written on the very last page. The ink different, the handwriting even more deteriorated. They followed me home. A sound from outside made Jake's head snap up. It was faint, barely audible, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the air itself rather than any earthly source. He moved to the window, brushing aside decades of grime, to peer out at the forest. The trees stood perfectly still in the windless morning, but something was wrong with the light filtering through them. It flickered in a pattern that his mind refused to process, like looking at a strobe light through frosted glass. The pulsing sound grew stronger, and Jake realized with mounting horror that he recognized the rhythm. It was the same pattern his grandfather had described in the journal, the same sequence that preceded the disappearances 65 years ago, and it was getting closer. The brass key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting 75 years for this exact moment. Jake's hand trembled as the mechanism clicked open, and he found himself holding his breath as he pushed against the heavy wooden door. The hinges protested with a prolonged groan that echoed through the surrounding pines. Cold air rushed out to meet him, not the stale mustiness he'd expected, but something sharp and metallic that made his sinuses burn. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through absolute darkness. The first thing that struck him was how pristine everything looked. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of decay despite decades of abandonment. The cabin's interior felt frozen in time, as if his grandfather had simply walked out yesterday and sealed it behind him. Jake stepped across the threshold, his boots echoing on polished hardwood floors. The beam of light swept across sparse but well-maintained furniture, a leather armchair positioned before a stone fireplace, a simple wooden table, built-in shelves lining the far wall. Everything arranged with military precision, but it was what occupied those shelves that made his blood run cold. Jars, dozens of them, each roughly the size of a mason jar, arranged in perfect rows. The glass containers caught his light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the walls. As he moved closer, his phone's illumination revealed that each jar contained something floating in a clear liquid. His grandfather's handwriting, that same careful script from the letters, labeled each container with dates, coordinates, and what appeared to be catalog numbers. Jake's light settled on the nearest jar, and he had to grip the shelf to keep from stumbling backward. Suspended in the preservative was what looked like a human finger, but wrong somehow. The flesh had an odd, mottled texture, and the fingernail was black and curved like a talon. The label read, Specimen 14A, grid reference 47 degree, 19 degree. March 15, 1948. The jar beside it contained something that might have been a tooth, except it was far too large and had too many roots extending from its base like gnarled tree branches. Another held what appeared to be a section of skin covered in scales that shifted color even in the static beam of his flashlight. Jake's stomach lurched as he continued down the shelf. Each jar contained something that defied explanation, organic matter that seemed simultaneously human and utterly alien. Some specimens appeared to be moving slightly, though that might have been the liquid responding to his movements or tricks of the light. At the far end of the bottom shelf, he found something that made him sink into his grandfather's chair. A jar larger than the others, containing what was unmistakably a human heart. But this heart had too many chambers, and dark veins spiderwebbed across its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The label simply read, Patient 0. March 23, 1948. Jake forced himself to look away from the grotesque collection and noticed a metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner. His hands shook as he pulled open the top drawer, revealing dozens of manila folders arranged chronologically. He grabbed the first one, dated March 1948. The documents inside were a mixture of military reports, medical charts, and his grandfather's personal notes. At the top of the stack was a black and white photograph that made his throat close up entirely. The image showed a bombed-out building, perhaps a hospital or research facility. Bodies littered the ground around it, but these weren't normal casualties of war. The corpses were twisted into impossible shapes, limbs bent at angles that human joints couldn't accommodate. Some appeared to have extra appendages growing from their torsos. Others seemed to be partially melted, their features running together like wax. A typewritten report paper clipped to the photo bore the header, Operation Nightfall, Classified Investigation into German Biological Weapons Program, Site 7. Jake's grandfather's handwritten notes filled the margins. Day 6. Found the laboratory intact beneath the ruins. Whatever they were doing here, they lost control of it. The survivors, God help us, I'm not sure they can still be called human. The infection appears to spread through direct contact. We've sealed the facility, but some of our own men were exposed before we understood the danger. Another note, in darker ink, seemed to have been added later, brought samples back for study. This cannot be allowed to spread. The world must never know what we found in that place, what we brought back with us. Jake's phone battery died, plunging him into complete darkness. In the sudden blackness, he could swear he heard something, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against glass, or talons. He fumbled for his phone's power button, hands slick with sweat, and when the light flickered back to life, he could have sworn one of the jars had moved slightly on its shelf. The sound came again, definitely from the direction of the specimens, and Jake realized with growing horror that some of his grandfather's collection might not be as dead as they appeared. The photographs scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, each one a window into a nightmare. Jake's mind refused to fully process. His hands trembled as he gathered them, the yellowed edges crackling between his fingers. The faces in the pictures stared back at him, soldiers he didn't recognize, posed in front of structures that shouldn't exist, buildings that defied physics, architecture that hurt to look at directly. Jake forced himself to study each image more carefully. The soldiers wore American uniforms, but their faces carried expressions he'd never seen before, not fear, not exhaustion, but something deeper, something broken. In the background of several photos, he could make out what appeared to be a military compound, but the structures seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways, as if the camera itself had been unable to capture their true geometry. One photograph made him pause. A group shot of 12 men standing in formation, and there, third from the left in the back row, was a face he recognized. Young, barely 18, but unmistakably his grandfather. Even at that age, Thomas Henley's eyes held the same haunted quality Jake remembered from childhood, though now they seemed almost innocent compared to the hollow stare in later photos. Jake flipped the image over. In his grandfather's careful handwriting, Project Threshold, Day 1. We don't know what we're walking into. His stomach clenched. He'd never heard of any Project Threshold, and his grandfather had been tight-lipped about his military service until the day he died. Jake had always assumed it was typical war trauma, the kind that made men bury their experiences deep and never speak of them again. Setting the photographs aside, he turned his attention to the wooden crate. The military markings were faded but still legible. Classified material, Project Threshold, authorized personnel only. Below that, a serial number and a date stamp, March 15, 1948. The lid was secured with old metal latches, green with oxidation. Jake worked them free, the protest of rusted metal echoing through the cabin. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be military-issue canvas, were objects that made no immediate sense. The first item looked like a compass, but instead of pointing north, its needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that changed each time Jake moved it. The brass casing was inscribed with symbols he didn't recognize, not quite mathematical, not quite linguistic, but somehow familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. Beneath the compass was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his grandfather's handwriting. Jake opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble at his touch. The first entry was dated March 20th, 1948. We've been here 5 days now, and I'm starting to understand why they chose volunteers. No one would believe what we're seeing if we tried to explain it. Colonel Morrison says the Germans were working on something they called Die Schwelle, the threshold. Apparently they got further than anyone thought possible before the war ended. Jake's breath caught. He flipped forward several pages. The structure is wrong. Every time I look at it, my eyes want to slide away, like they're trying to protect me from seeing something I shouldn't. Davis threw up just from walking around the perimeter. Henderson won't stop talking about the sounds, says he can hear something calling from inside, but the rest of us don't hear anything. Maybe that's worse. The entries became increasingly erratic as Jake read on. His grandfather's normally precise handwriting grew shaky, desperate. Day 12. Morrison ordered half the team inside today. They came back changed. Won't say what they saw, but Phillips keeps drawing the same symbol over and over. It matches the ones we found in the German documents. I'm starting to think we should have left this thing buried. Day 15. The nightmares are getting worse. We're all seeing the same things now. Endless corridors, doors that lead nowhere, and something waiting at the center of it all. Morrison says we're close to a breakthrough, but I think we've already broken something we can't fix. Jake flipped to the final entry, dated April 3rd, 1948. They're shutting it down. Thank God they're shutting it down. What we found in there, what we brought back, it's not meant for this world. Morrison's dead. So is half the team. The survivors are being sworn to secrecy and scattered to different units. They're sealing the whole site and pretending none of this ever happened. But I can still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments, calling, waiting. The threshold doesn't just go one way. I understand that now, and I think we left it open just a crack. The journal trembled in Jake's hands as he absorbed the implications. His grandfather had been part of some classified military experiment involving German research. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, but what did any of this have to do with the cabin? As if in response to his thoughts, a sound drifted through the mountain air, distant but unmistakable. The same rhythmic tapping he'd heard the night before, but closer now, much closer. And this time, it was coming from beneath the cabin floor. The basement stairs groaned under Jake's weight as he descended into the darkness below the cabin. His flashlight beam cut through air thick with decades of stagnation, revealing rough stone walls that seemed to weep moisture. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, and he found himself wishing he'd brought a heavier jacket. At the bottom, his light swept across what appeared to be a typical cellar. Wooden shelves lined the walls, their contents obscured by dust and shadow. But as he moved deeper into the space, something felt wrong. The proportions were off. According to his rough mental calculation, this basement extended well beyond the cabin's foundation. His grandfather had excavated far more than necessary for simple storage. Jake's beam fell upon a workbench pushed against the far wall, its surface cluttered with tools he didn't recognize. Strange metal implements lay scattered across the wood, their purposes unclear but somehow unsettling. They looked almost surgical in nature, yet bore no resemblance to any medical instruments he'd ever seen. Beside the workbench, a tall cabinet stood partially open. Jake approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet, despite being underground. The cabinet contained row upon row of glass jars, each filled with a murky liquid that had turned brown with age. Most were empty now, their contents long since evaporated, but a few still held their mysterious preservatives. And floating within those remaining specimens were things that made Jake's stomach lurch. Organic matter of some kind, twisted, unidentifiable fragments that might once have been tissue. In one jar, something that could have been a finger, if fingers had too many joints and ended in what looked like thorns. Another contained a mass of what appeared to be skin, but skin that shifted color even in the static light of his flashlight, cycling through hues that shouldn't exist in nature. Jake stumbled backward, his light dancing wildly as his hands shook. The beam caught something else, a series of photographs tacked to the wall beside the cabinet. Black and white images that, even in the poor light, were clearly documentation of some kind. He forced himself closer, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The photographs showed what looked like an autopsy in progress. A figure lay on a table, humanoid but wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Too tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its skin appeared to shift and flow even in the static photographs, and its face— Jake turned away, bile rising in his throat. When he looked back, forcing himself to examine the images more clinically, he noticed something that chilled him more than the grotesque subject matter. In several shots, a man in a military uniform stood beside the table, clearly directing the procedure. The man was his grandfather. Young, maybe 30 years old, but unmistakably Grandpa Ed. The same strong jawline, the same intense eyes that Jake remembered from family gatherings. But this version of his grandfather wore an expression Jake had never seen, a mixture of scientific curiosity and something approaching hunger. More photographs showed additional specimens, bodies that seemed to have been pulled from nightmares, each more disturbing than the last. Some appeared almost human until you noticed the extra limbs or the way their torsos twisted in directions that defied anatomy. Others were so alien that Jake's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. At the bottom of the photo collection, he found what looked like field reports, handwritten notes in his grandfather's familiar script, documenting locations, dates, and procedures. The locations meant nothing to Jake, remote coordinates that could have been anywhere in the world. But the dates were all from 1948, clustered around the time his grandfather had returned from the war. One report caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one was typed on official letterhead, though the agency name had been blacked out with thick ink. The visible text made Jake's blood run cold. Subject exhibits unprecedented regenerative capabilities. Preliminary dissection reveals cellular structure unlike any known terrestrial organism. Recommend immediate containment and continued study. Note: subject remains conscious and aware throughout all procedures. Standard anesthetics prove ineffective. The report was signed by someone called Dr. Morrison. But beneath that signature, in his grandfather's handwriting, was a single line that made Jake's knees weak. God help us all. We should have left them where we found them. A sound from upstairs made Jake freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the cabin floor above his head. But that was impossible. He'd locked the door behind him, and there was no other way in. The footsteps paused directly overhead, then changed direction, moving toward what Jake realized was the location of the trapdoor. His flashlight flickered, the beam growing dimmer. The footsteps above had stopped, but now he could hear something else. A low humming sound that seemed to come from the very walls around him. It was almost musical, but wrong, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human. The humming grew louder, and Jake realized with growing horror that it was coming closer. The basement stairs creaked under Jake's weight as he descended into the darkness below. The beam of his flashlight cut through the thick air, revealing stone walls that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Each step downward felt like a descent into something ancient and forgotten, something that predated the cabin above by decades. At the bottom of the stairs, Jake swept his flashlight across the basement floor. Unlike the wooden planks above, this foundation was solid stone, worn smooth by time. The air tasted metallic, with an underlying sweetness that made his stomach turn. He breathed through his mouth and pressed forward. The basement stretched further than the cabin's footprint should have allowed. Jake frowned, trying to orient himself. The space seemed to extend well beyond the structure above, carved directly into the mountain itself. His grandfather hadn't just built a cabin here, he'd excavated something much larger. Along the far wall, Jake discovered a series of wooden crates, identical to the ones upstairs, but larger, much larger. Some stood nearly 6 feet tall, their surfaces marked with the same military codes and that persistent symbol he'd been seeing everywhere. His hands shook as he approached the nearest crate. The lid wasn't nailed shut like the others had been. Instead, it sat loose, as if someone had opened it recently and simply replaced the cover. Jake's skin crawled at the thought that he might not be alone up here, that someone else had been accessing his grandfather's secrets. He lifted the lid and immediately staggered backward. Inside the crate, suspended in a clear, viscous fluid, was something that might have once been human. The thing's limbs were elongated, stretched to impossible proportions, while its torso had contracted into a barrel-like shape. Its skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing dark veins that pulsed with their own rhythm. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, wide open, aware, tracking Jake's movement. It was alive. Jake stumbled away from the crate, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. He needed to leave, he needed to run, but his body wouldn't obey, frozen in place by the impossibility of what he'd just witnessed. That's when he noticed the tubes. A complex network of clear plastic tubing connected the crates to each other and to a central apparatus that hummed with electric power. The tubes pulsed with the same dark fluid he'd seen in the creature's veins. Whatever his grandfather had been doing down here, it was still active, still functioning after more than 70 years. Jake forced himself to check the other crates, though every instinct screamed against it. Each contained a similar horror, beings that had once been human, transformed into something else entirely. Some were more changed than others. In one crate, he found what looked like a young woman, her features still recognizable despite the elongated skull and the extra joints that had appeared in her arms and legs. She was beautiful in a terrible way, and when she saw Jake, she pressed her hand against the glass and mouthed a single word, "Please." Jake's flashlight beam caught something else, a metal plaque attached to this crate. Unlike the military codes on the others, this one bore a name, Marie Chen, volunteer, 1948. The date hit him like a physical blow. 1948, the same year his grandfather had returned from his mysterious mission and sealed the cabin. The same year he'd supposedly come back changed according to family whispers. Jake checked the other plaques with growing horror. Robert Walsh, volunteer, 1948. David Kozlov, volunteer, 1949. The dates progressed through the late 1940s, suggesting his grandfather had continued his work well after the war ended. But the final crate stopped Jake cold. The plaque read, William Chen, volunteer, 1950. William. His grandfather's name was William. Jake approached the final crate with trembling hands. The creature inside was more changed than the others, barely recognizable as human. Its head had swollen to enormous proportions, and its limbs had multiplied into a branching network of appendages. But the eyes were unmistakably human, unmistakably familiar. Jake had seen those same pale blue eyes every Christmas morning, every birthday, every family gathering. The same eyes that had looked at him with such sadness and regret in those final months before his grandfather's death. The thing that had raised his father, the man who had taught Jake to fish and whittle and work with his hands. It wasn't his grandfather. It had been one of these transformed beings, living among his family for decades, playing the role of the man who had died in whatever experiment had created these horrors. The tubes connecting the crates pulsed faster now, as if responding to Jake's presence. The creatures stirred in their fluid prisons, pressing against the glass, their mouths moving in silent communication. And somewhere in that basement, carved from mountain stone, something began to laugh. A sound that was neither fully human nor entirely alien, but something caught forever between the two. Jake ran. The morning light filtering through the cabin's dusty windows revealed details that had been mercifully hidden in the previous night's shadows. Jake sat hunched over the leather journal, his grandfather's cramped handwriting swimming before his tired eyes. He'd barely slept, haunted by the photographs and the implications they carried. Day 847, in the mountains. The subject's condition continues to deteriorate. Dr. Hoffman insists the treatments are necessary, but I've seen enough death to recognize it approaching. The thing is, this isn't death as I understand it. Something else is happening here. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the page. The entry was dated December 15th, 1947, just weeks before his grandfather had supposedly returned home from the war. The child spoke today. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed my ears entirely. I heard it in my mind, felt it crawling through my thoughts like ice water. It wanted to know about home, about the valley below. I told it nothing, but I fear it saw everything anyway. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He glanced toward the back room where he'd discovered the photographs, its door now firmly closed. The memory of those images, the pale, emaciated figure strapped to the hospital bed, the eyes that seemed far too aware, made his stomach churn. The journal's pages were brittle with age, some entries barely legible. His grandfather's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the dates progressed, as if written by a man slowly losing his grip on sanity. January 3rd, 1948. Dr. Hoffman is dead. Found him in the laboratory this morning, frozen solid despite the heating system running at full capacity. His face, God, his face. The subject's restraints were undisturbed, but I know it was responsible. The temperature drops whenever it becomes agitated, and Hoffman had been pushing too hard with the experiments. Jake's breath caught. He remembered the sudden cold that had gripped the cabin the night before, the way his breath had misted in the air despite the mild weather outside. His eyes darted to the thermometer on the wall. It read a comfortable 72 degrees, but the memory of that bone-deep chill remained vivid. January 7th, 1948. I am alone now with the subject. The other researchers evacuated after Hoffman's death, but someone must maintain the containment. Command has classified this entire operation beyond top secret. As far as the world knows, none of this ever happened. The official story is that we're conducting atmospheric research. The subject must not reach populated areas. I've seen what it can do. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. Jake could picture his grandfather, a young soldier barely older than Jake himself, trapped in this remote cabin with something that defied explanation. The isolation, the responsibility, the terror, it would have broken most men. January 15th, 1948. It spoke to me again today, called me by name, though I never told it what to call me. It knows things about home, about Martha, about the farm. It's learning, adapting. The intelligence behind those eyes is vast and alien. I fear I may be losing the ability to resist its influence. Martha was Jake's grandmother. She died when he was 12, but he remembered her kindness, her gentle spirit. The thought of this thing somehow knowing about her, possibly threatening her, filled him with a cold rage. January 20th, 1948. The nightmares have begun. I see the subject walking through town, its pale form moving from house to house. In the dreams, the temperature drops so severely that people freeze in their beds. The cold spreads outward like a plague, leaving behind only silence and ice. I wake screaming, but I don't think they're dreams. I think it's showing me the future. Jake's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold the journal steady. The entries continued, each one painting a picture of his grandfather's growing desperation and the mounting horror of his situation. January 28, 1948. I understand now what must be done. The subject cannot be contained indefinitely, and it cannot be allowed to escape. There is only one solution, though it damns my soul to even consider it. I pray that future generations will forgive me for what I'm about to do. The entry cut off abruptly. Jake frantically turned the pages, but they were blank. Whatever his grandfather had decided to do, he hadn't recorded it. The final entry was dated the day before his grandfather's official return home. Jake closed the journal and sat in the growing silence of the cabin. The morning sun had climbed higher, but somehow the light seemed dimmer now, as if filtered through an invisible veil. He thought about his grandfather's return home, how he'd never spoken of the war, how he'd lived out his remaining years as a quiet farmer who jumped at unexpected sounds and always kept the house uncomfortably warm. A soft sound from the back room made Jake's blood freeze. It was barely audible, like ice crystals forming on glass, but in the cabin's silence it rang out like a gunshot. Whatever his grandfather had done in those final days of January 1948, Jake was beginning to suspect it hadn't been enough. The temperature in the cabin began to drop. The basement stretched deeper than the cabin's foundation should have allowed. Jake's flashlight beams swept across rough-hewn stone walls that belonged to no construction he'd ever seen his grandfather undertake. The air grew colder with each step downward, carrying that same metallic scent he'd noticed upstairs, now mixed with something earthier, more ancient. Behind him, Sarah's breathing had become shallow, quick puffs that misted in the suddenly frigid air. "Jake, this doesn't feel right. How is there a basement here? Your grandfather built this cabin on bedrock." He wanted to agree, wanted to turn around and seal whatever they'd opened, but the photographs in his pocket seemed to pulse with their own weight. His grandfather's face in that unit photo, standing beside men whose eyes held the same haunted quality Jake now recognized in every family gathering. Every holiday dinner where the old man would suddenly go quiet and stare at nothing. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. Unlike everything else they'd encountered, this door showed signs of recent use, the hinges oiled, the handle worn smooth. A brass nameplate had been screwed into the wood at eye level, but the letters were in a language Jake didn't recognize. Below it, scratched into the wood with what looked like a knife blade, someone had carved what we brought back. "Your grandfather's handwriting," Sarah whispered, running her finger along the crude letters. Jake's throat constricted. He'd seen that same angular script on birthday cards, Christmas notes, the deed to this very property. But this carving looked different, urgent, desperate, like a warning scratched in haste. The door opened without resistance. The room beyond defied the cabin's modest dimensions. Circular and vast, it stretched into darkness that Jake's flashlight couldn't penetrate. The walls were lined with what looked like military equipment from the 1940s. Radio sets, maps, crates stenciled with serial numbers and classifications he didn't understand. But it was the center of the room that made Jake's blood freeze. 12 chairs arranged in a perfect circle. 12 chairs, each one occupied. The figures sat with military precision, backs straight, hands folded in their laps. They wore the same uniforms Jake had seen in the photographs, the same unit patches, but their faces... "Oh, God," Sarah breathed, grabbing Jake's arms so tightly her nails drew blood. The faces were masks, not Halloween masks or theatrical props, but something that looked almost alive. crafted from what might have been leather or hide, but too smooth, too perfect. Each mask bore human features, but the proportions were subtly wrong. Eyes too large, mouths that curved too wide, foreheads that sloped at impossible angles. And they were all facing the empty 13th chair. Jake's flashlight trembled in his grip. One of the figures, third from the left, wearing sergeant stripes, wore a mask that looked exactly like the face in his grandfather's unit photo. The man who'd been identified as Thompson, K. "They're not breathing," Sarah whispered. Jake forced himself to step closer, fighting every instinct screaming at him to run. The figures remained motionless, but as his light played across them, he noticed small details that made his stomach turn. The uniforms were pristine, as if freshly pressed, but where skin should have shown at collar and cuff, there was only darkness, not shadow, actual void, as if the uniforms contained nothing at all. A manila folder lay on the 13th chair. Jake's name was written on the tab in his grandfather's careful handwriting. "Don't touch it," Sarah warned, but Jake was already reaching forward. The moment his fingers made contact with the folder, the temperature plummeted. Their breath became visible clouds, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle, something moved. Not footsteps, a sliding, scraping sound like massive weight being dragged across stone. Jake flipped open the folder. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore a message in the same urgent handwriting as the door. "They followed us home, all of us. We made a pact, 12 men, 1 location, eternal watch. I kept them here, Jake. Kept them fed, kept them satisfied. But I'm dying and the hunger never stops. The chair is yours now. The responsibility passes to family. Blood calls to blood. Forgive me." Below that, a list of dates stretching from 1948 to the present. Next to each date, a name. Jake recognized some of them. Missing hikers, hunters who'd never returned, the occasional drifter whose disappearance had made the local papers. The scraping sound grew closer. "Jake, we need to leave, now." Sarah's voice cracked with terror. But the figures in the chairs had begun to move, their masked heads turning in perfect unison toward the sound approaching from the darkness. And in that movement, Jake finally understood what his grandfather had brought back from whatever classified mission had destroyed his unit, what they had awakened, what they had tried to contain, and what was about to be his inheritance. The temperature inside the hidden chamber dropped noticeably as Jake descended the crude wooden steps, each board groaning under his weight. The flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing stone walls that predated the cabin by decades, possibly centuries. This wasn't just a basement, it was something far older, carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. Sarah followed close behind, her breathing quick and shallow. "Jake, this doesn't feel right. The air down here—" She was right. The atmosphere felt thick, almost viscous, carrying scents that didn't belong. Antiseptic mixed with something organic and decay-sweet. Jake's skin crawled as he swept the light across the chamber, revealing its true scope. The space stretched far beyond what should have been possible under the small cabin, extending deep into the mountain itself. Metal tables lined the walls, their surfaces stained with substances that had long since dried to rusty brown patches. Shelves held rows of glass jars, their contents obscured by decades of dust and condensation. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden desk, its surface covered with documents held down by paperweights that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, moving toward the nearest table. "What was your grandfather doing down here?" Jake approached the desk, his hands trembling as he lifted the first document. The header made his blood run cold. Project Lazarus, classified, eyes only. Below it, in his grandfather's familiar handwriting, were notes that made no sense, equations mixed with anatomical diagrams, chemical formulas accompanied by what looked like ritual symbols. "Sarah, look at this." He held up a photograph that had been tucked between the pages. The black and white image showed a group of soldiers standing around what appeared to be an excavation site. In the background, Partially unearthed was a structure that looked disturbingly similar to the chamber they now stood in. Sarah moved closer, squinting at the image. "That's not from World War II, is it? Look at those uniforms, they're not right. And that writing on the stones." Jake examined the photograph more carefully. She was correct. The uniforms were wrong, the equipment anachronistic, but it was definitely his grandfather in the center of the group, unmistakable even in the faded image. Yet if this wasn't from the 1940s, when had it been taken? A soft sound from deeper in the chamber made them both freeze. It was barely audible, like fabric brushing against stone, but it came from the darkness beyond their light's reach. "Did you hear?" Sarah began, but Jake held up a hand for silence. The sound came again, clearer this time. Definitely movement, deliberate and careful. Jake swung the flashlight toward the source, its beam revealing another passage leading even deeper into the mountain. The light caught something pale disappearing around the corner, too quick to identify but unmistakably organic. "We should go," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. But Jake was already moving toward the passage, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. "Wait, there's something else down here." He grabbed another document from the desk, a journal entry in his grandfather's hand, dated just weeks before Jake was born. "The specimens are becoming increasingly active. Dr. Brennan believes the electromagnetic field generated by the mountain's mineral composition may be accelerating the process. What we thought was preservation has become something else entirely. God help us, we've made a terrible mistake. The seal must hold. It must hold." "Jake!" Sarah's sharp whisper snapped him back to the present. "The light! Look at the jars!" He turned the flashlight toward the shelves and his stomach lurched. The contents of the glass containers were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. Things that should have been dead for decades were stirring in their preservation fluid, responding to their presence. From the deeper passage came another sound, not footsteps, but something being dragged across stone, getting closer. Jake stuffed the documents into his jacket and grabbed Sarah's hand. "Now we go. Now." They rushed toward the stairs, but as they reached the bottom step, the flashlight flickered and died. In the absolute darkness, the sounds from the passage grew louder, more purposeful. Something was definitely approaching, and it was no longer trying to hide its presence. Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, its weaker beam casting dancing shadows as they climbed. Behind them, Jake could hear what sounded like breathing, ragged, labored, but definitely breathing. Multiple sources, as if several things were moving through the chamber below. They burst through the hidden door into the cabin's main room, and Jake immediately began pushing furniture against the opening. But even as he worked, he knew with cold certainty that whatever was down there had been waiting far longer than they could possibly barricade themselves in. The real question wasn't how to keep it contained. It was whether his grandfather had managed to do so for over 70 years, or if the seal he'd written about was finally beginning to fail. The creature's screech still echoed in Jake's ears as he stumbled through the darkness, his grandfather's journal clutched against his chest. The flashlight beam danced wildly ahead of him, illuminating fragments of the nightmare he'd just escaped, overturned furniture, scattered papers, and dark stains that looked disturbingly fresh despite being decades old. Behind him, something crashed against the basement door he'd barely managed to slam shut. The sound of splintering wood sent ice through his veins. Whatever his grandfather had brought back from that God-forsaken mission was still very much alive, and it was furious. Jake's hands shook as he fumbled with the journal, desperate to understand what he was dealing with. The creature, if that's what it was, had moved with impossible speed, its elongated limbs and pale, translucent skin defying everything he thought he knew about the natural world. But the worst part had been its face, almost human, but wrong in ways that made his stomach churn. He found himself in what must have been his grandfather's study, though dust sheets covered most of the furniture like ghostly sentinels. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface covered with papers that crumbled at his touch. Maps, military documents and photographs scattered across the wood, all bearing the same classified stamps he'd seen in the journal. Another crash from below, followed by an inhuman wail that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the cabin. Jake's flashlight beam swept across a photograph that made him freeze. His grandfather stood with a group of soldiers in what looked like a cave system, their faces grim and hollow-eyed. But it was what lurked in the shadows behind them that stole Jake's breath, a pale figure that looked disturbingly familiar. The journal's pages rustled as he flipped through them with trembling fingers, searching for answers. His grandfather's handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, the neat military script dissolving into desperate scrawls. Day 847. It's growing stronger. The feeding isn't enough anymore. Sarah asked about the sounds again. I told her it was raccoons in the walls. God forgive me, but what else can I say? That I've damned our entire family? Day 851. Found it in Tommy's room last night, just standing there, watching him sleep. It didn't hurt him, thank Christ, but the way it looked at me, it knows. It knows I can't bring myself to destroy it. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Tommy. His father's name was Thomas, and everyone had called him Tommy as a child. This thing had been near his father, had watched him sleep. The implications crashed over Jake like an avalanche. A new sound drifted up from the basement, not the violent thrashing from before, but something worse. Scratching, methodical, patient scratching, as if the creature was systematically clawing its way through the door. His flashlight beam caught another photograph, this one showing his grandfather alone in what appeared to be the cabin's basement. He was younger, but his eyes held a haunted quality that Jake now understood. In his arms, he cradled something wrapped in a military blanket, something small and struggling. The journal's final entries painted a picture of a man slowly losing his sanity. Day 892, can't kill it. Tried 3 times now, but every time I raise the gun, I see what it used to be, what they made it into. Those bastards in the lab called it a success, a perfect weapon that could infiltrate enemy lines, mimic human appearance, feed on fear itself. They didn't understand what they'd created until it was too late. Day 900, the ceiling begins tomorrow. Sarah thinks I'm renovating the basement. I've gathered enough supplies to last. How long? How long does something like this live? How long will my family have to bear this burden? The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, impossibly, he heard his grandfather's voice, young and afraid, just as it must have sounded all those years ago. Please, the voice whispered from directly behind him, please don't leave me here alone. Jake spun around, his flashlight beam revealing nothing but empty air and dust motes dancing in the light. But the voice came again, closer now, tinged with a desperate hunger that made his skin crawl. I've been so hungry, Jake, so very hungry. The photographs on the desk began to flutter as if caught in a breeze, though the air in the room was perfectly still. Jake backed toward the door, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The creature had gotten out. Somehow it had escaped the basement and was here with him, wearing his grandfather's voice like a mask. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Jake's breath came out in visible puffs. Behind him, the study door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the cabin like a death knell. He was trapped, just as his grandfather had intended all those years ago. But now, Jake understood the horrible truth. His grandfather hadn't been the captor. He'd been the first victim. The silence in the cabin felt alive, pressing against Jake's eardrums like something with intent. He stood frozen in the doorway, the journal clutched against his chest as the implications of what he'd read crashed over him in waves. His grandfather hadn't just participated in some classified military operation. He'd been part of something that had torn holes in reality itself. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, as if they were pools of the same darkness that had consumed the Blackwood facility. Jake's eyes darted to the peculiar scratches on the walls that he'd dismissed earlier. Now they looked less like random damage and more like desperate attempts to ward something off. A soft scraping sound came from the back room. Jake's blood turned to ice. He'd checked every room when he first arrived. The cabin had been empty, sealed tight for over 70 years. Nothing could have gotten inside. Another scrape, followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across wooden floorboards. His rational mind screamed at him to run, to burst through the door and never look back. But something else, maybe his grandfather's blood, maybe just stubborn curiosity, kept his feet planted. He needed to know. After everything he'd discovered, he couldn't walk away from the truth now. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight and crept toward the sound. The back room had served as his grandfather's study, filled with dusty books and papers that had seemed mundane hours ago. Now every shadow could be hiding something that didn't belong in this world. The scraping came again, definitely from inside the study. Jake pressed himself against the doorframe and peered around the corner. The room looked exactly as he'd left it, except for one thing. The heavy oak desk had moved 3 feet to the left, revealing a section of floorboard that looked different from the rest. Newer wood, or maybe boards that had been replaced. Jake's heart hammered as he stepped into the room. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and he winced at each sound. Whatever had moved that desk, and he was trying very hard not to think about how a desk that heavy could move on its own, might still be here. He knelt beside the exposed section of floor and ran his fingers along the edges of the boards. They were definitely replacements, installed over what felt like an opening beneath. His grandfather had hidden something under here, something important enough to seal away and disguise. The journal had mentioned keeping it contained. Jake had assumed that referred to the knowledge, the terrible things they'd learned about the spaces between dimensions. But what if it had been more literal? Using his multi-tool, Jake preed at the boards. They came up easier than expected, as if they'd been designed to be removed by someone who knew the secret. The smell hit him immediately, not decay or mustiness, but something metallic and sharp that made his sinuses burn. Beneath the floorboards was a metal container, about the size of a briefcase but thicker, made from the same strange alloy described in the journal. The surface was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, carved deep into the metal and filled with what looked like silver. Jake's hands shook as he lifted the container. It was surprisingly light, but it seemed to vibrate subtly in his grip, like it contained something under pressure trying to get out. There was no visible lock, just a seam around the edges that suggested the top could be removed. But burned into the metal near what might have been a handle were words in his grandfather's handwriting: never open, never destroy. Keep sealed until the end of all things. The rational part of Jake's mind was screaming warnings. Every horror movie he'd ever seen, every cautionary tale about forbidden knowledge, told him to put the container back and seal the floor again. But the journal had made it clear that simply ignoring this wouldn't make it go away. Whatever was in here, his grandfather had brought it back from that facility. He'd kept it hidden for 70 years, but he hadn't destroyed it. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe destruction would only make things worse. Jake carried the container to the main room and set it on the table beside the journal. In the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, the symbols seemed to shift and writhe. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was fatigue and stress, but the sensation persisted. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the faint whisper of wind through the pines outside. Jake stared at the container, weighing his options. He could leave it sealed, pack everything up, and try to pretend none of this had ever happened. But the journal had made it clear that the threat wasn't contained. It was growing. Other facilities had been compromised. The barriers between dimensions were weakening. His grandfather had spent his entire life carrying this burden alone. Maybe it was time for Jake to understand exactly what that burden entailed. He reached for the container's edge, hesitated, then began to work at the seal. The basement felt like descending into the earth's bowels, each step creaking ominously beneath Jake's weight. The flashlight beam cut through darkness so thick it seemed almost solid, revealing stone walls that wept with decades of accumulated moisture. Sarah's breathing echoed behind him, sharp and quick. "Jesus, what is that smell?" she whispered. Jake had been trying to ignore it, a mixture of decay, metal, and something else, something organic that made his stomach turn. The beam swept across the floor, illuminating scattered papers, broken glass, and what looked like laboratory equipment covered in rust and grime. "Grandpa had a lab down here," Jake murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "But why hide it?" The answer came as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Against the far wall stood a series of metal containers, each one roughly the size of a coffin. Most were empty, their lids thrown open to reveal nothing but stained interiors. But 3 remained sealed, and from these came a low mechanical humming that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm. "We should leave, right now." But Jake was already moving toward the nearest sealed container, drawn by a horrifying fascination. The metal was unmarked except for a series of numbers stenciled in military font, 1947A. Below that, a smaller notation that made his blood freeze. Subject, Williams Thomas. Status, ongoing. "My grandfather's name was Thomas," Jake said, his voice barely audible. The humming grew louder as they approached, and now Jake could see that each container was connected to a complex network of cables and tubes that snaked across the ceiling to a central control panel. Lights blinked steadily on the panel, green, red, amber, indicating that whatever system this was, it was still very much operational. "Jake, please," Sarah's voice cracked. "This is insane. We need to call someone." "Call who? And tell them what?" Jake reached for the latch on container 1947A. That my dead grandfather might be alive in his basement? The latch was heavier than expected, requiring both hands to turn. As it clicked open, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft hissing sound like air being released. Jake hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. The smell hit them first, antiseptic, mixed with something putrid and wrong. Inside the container, submerged in a viscous yellow-green fluid, was a human form. But it wasn't quite human anymore. The body was pale and bloated, skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. Tubes ran from its mouth and nose to pumps that had been keeping the fluid circulating. But the worst part, the detail that sent Jake stumbling backward, was the face. Even distorted by decades of chemical preservation, he could see the family resemblance, the strong jaw, the prominent nose, the same eyes that stared back at him from old photographs. "That's him," Jake whispered. "That's my grandfather." Sarah was backing toward the stairs, shaking her head violently. "No, no, 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 this isn't possible. People don't just preserve themselves." Jake forced himself to look closer at the control panel. Handwritten notes were taped beside various switches and dials, all in his grandfather's careful script. Cellular regeneration active. Neural pathways stable. Awaiting resurrection protocol. A loose journal lay open beside the controls. Jake picked it up with trembling hands, reading aloud from the final entry, March 15, 1948. The procedure was successful beyond our wildest expectations. Death is no longer permanent, but the cost, God help me, the cost is our humanity. I've seen what we become when we return. I cannot allow this knowledge to spread. I will remain here in stasis until someone can find a way to reverse what we've done. "What procedure?" Sarah demanded from halfway up the stairs. "What did he do?" Jake flipped back through the journal pages, finding references to military experiments, classified research, and something called the Lazarus Protocol. Images filled his mind. Soldiers rising from battlefields, wounds healing impossibly fast, eyes that held no recognition of their former selves. A new sound filled the basement then, a rhythmic thumping from one of the other containers, then another. Jake's flashlight beam revealed that the remaining sealed containers were marked with different dates, 1947B and 1947C, and the thumping was growing stronger, more insistent. "They're waking up," Jake breathed. The control panel lights began flashing rapidly, and a mechanical voice crackled from hidden speakers. "Stasis protocols compromised. Beginning revival sequence. Stand clear of containers." Jake grabbed the journal and ran for the stairs as the first container began to open with a pneumatic hiss. Behind him, something that might once have been human began to move in the darkness, and the sound it made was nothing like breathing. "Move!" he shouted to Sarah, taking the basement steps 3 at a time. "Whatever happens, don't look back!" Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph of his grandfather standing beside the monstrous creature, both of them illuminated by the sickly green glow that now pulsed stronger than ever from the basement. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. His grandfather hadn't been fighting these things, he'd been working with them. The journal entry beneath the photograph confirmed his worst fears. Written in his grandfather's meticulous handwriting were the words that would haunt him forever, day 847 since first contact. "The symbiosis is complete. Thomas has accepted the enhancement willingly. We are no longer merely human." A sound from the basement made Jake's blood freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the wooden stairs. But that was impossible. He'd seen Thomas's body, hadn't he? The desiccated corpse strapped to that nightmare chair. The footsteps continued, each creak of the old boards echoing through the cabin like a death knell. Jake clutched the journal to his chest and backed toward the front door, his grandfather's secrets now a terrible weight in his hands. The green light from below grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of any light source. "Jacob." The voice that called his name was his grandfather's, but wrong somehow, distorted, as if spoken through water or from a great distance. "You've come home at last." Jake's back hit the front door, and his fumbling fingers found the deadbolt. But even as he turned it, he knew with bone-deep certainty that locks and doors meant nothing here. Whatever his grandfather had become, whatever he'd allowed those things to do to him, physical barriers were merely suggestions now. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs, and Jake could hear them moving across the living room floor. He spun around, yanked the door open, and plunged into the mountain night. The journal fell from his grasp, pages scattering in the wind like dying leaves. Behind him, the cabin's windows began to glow with that same nauseating green light he'd seen in the basement. It pulsed like a heartbeat, growing stronger with each throb. Jake ran blindly through the trees, branches tearing at his clothes and skin, the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly ahead of him. But the forest itself seemed to be changing. The trees looked wrong. Their bark had a slick, organic quality that reflected the green glow now emanating from multiple sources around him. As he ran, Jake realized with mounting horror that the infection, or enhancement, or whatever his grandfather had brought back from that classified mission, hadn't been contained to the cabin. It had been spreading for 75 years. A low rumble shook the ground beneath his feet, and Jake stumbled, catching himself against what he thought was a tree trunk. His hand came away covered in warm, viscous fluid that glowed faintly green. The tree pulsed under his touch, and Jake jerked his hand back with a strangled cry. "There's nowhere to run, Jacob." His grandfather's voice seemed to come from everywhere now. The trees, the ground, the very air itself. "This is our legacy, our gift to the world. Your father understood eventually. He came back just as you have." Jake's mind reeled. His father? The man who'd supposedly died in a car accident when Jake was 12? The official story had never sat right with him. His father had been an excellent driver, and the crash had been on a straight stretch of road in perfect weather. Movement in his peripheral vision made him spin around. Shapes were emerging from between the infected trees, humanoid but wrong, their proportions subtly off, their skin bearing that same sick luminescence. They moved with purpose, forming a loose circle around him. And then Jake saw him. His grandfather stepped into the clearing, but the old man Jake remembered was gone. This thing wore his grandfather's face like an ill-fitting mask, and beneath the familiar features, something alien and terrible looked out through eyes that glowed like radioactive emeralds. "The war never ended, Jacob," his grandfather said, his voice now clearly coming from multiple throats. "We simply chose the winning side. The old world is dying. Humanity as you know it is obsolete. But we offer evolution, purpose, unity. One of the circling figures stepped closer, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. It was his father, or what his father had become. The familiar features were there, but enhanced, perfected in ways that made Jake's stomach churn. "Hello, son," his father said, extending one hand toward Jake. The fingers were too long, ending in what might have been claws or might have been something worse. "It's time to come home, time to join the family properly." Jake looked around the circle of transformed faces, recognizing features from old family photographs among the alien modifications. Generations of his bloodline, all of them changed, all of them waiting. The green light pulsed stronger, and Jake felt something stirring in his own blood, an answering call that terrified him more than anything else he'd experienced in this nightmare. The choice before him was simple: run and be hunted down, or surrender to whatever had claimed his family. Jake's hands trembled as he descended the narrow staircase behind the bookshelf, each step echoing in the confined space. The musty air grew thicker with every breath, carrying the weight of decades-old secrets. His grandfather's journal pressed against his chest, where he'd tucked it inside his jacket, the leather binding still warm from his fevered reading. The basement opened into a room that defied the cabin's modest exterior. Military equipment lined the walls. Radios, maps, and devices Jake couldn't identify, but it was the far wall that made his blood freeze. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned to a corkboard in neat rows. Each showed the same impossible sight: creatures that shouldn't exist, twisted amalgamations of human and something else entirely. In the center hung a larger photograph, and Jake's knees nearly buckled when he recognized the figure standing among a group of soldiers. His grandfather, decades younger but unmistakably him, holding what appeared to be a containment device. Behind him loomed a massive specimen, its elongated limbs and hollow eye sockets making Jake's skin crawl. "Operation Blackwater," he whispered, remembering the code name from the journal. "Jesus Christ, Grandpa, what were you involved in?" A sound from upstairs made him freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the cabin floor above. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he'd left the front door unlocked. The footsteps paused directly over his head, and he could hear the faint creak of floorboards settling under someone's weight. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. He was completely cut off, alone in this underground chamber with evidence of horrors he was only beginning to understand. The footsteps resumed, heading toward the bookshelf entrance. Jake scanned the room desperately, his eyes falling on a metal cabinet in the corner. He rushed to it, finding it unlocked, and discovered files upon files of military documents. One folder caught his attention: post-mission containment protocols. His grandfather's handwriting filled the margins, notes that made Jake's blood run cold. Subject exhibits adaptive intelligence. Standard containment insufficient. Requires constant monitoring. Note: subject has shown ability to mimic human speech patterns and mannerisms. Extreme caution advised. The footsteps above had stopped. Jake strained to listen, but the silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. He grabbed several files and photographs, shoving them into his jacket alongside the journal. Whatever was happening, he needed evidence, proof that this nightmare was real. A loud crash from upstairs made him jump, followed by the distinctive sound of the bookshelf being moved. Someone had found the entrance. Jake looked around frantically for another way out, but the basement appeared to be a dead end. His only option was to hide and hope whoever was up there would leave. He squeezed behind a large radio console just as footsteps began descending the stairs. The person moved slowly, methodically, and Jake could hear them breathing, a wet, labored sound that didn't seem entirely human. Through a gap in the equipment, he caught a glimpse of legs descending, but something was wrong with the gait, too fluid, too precise. "Jake," a voice called softly, and his blood turned to ice. It was his grandfather's voice, impossible as that was. "I know you're down here, boy. We need to talk." Jake bit his lip to keep from crying out. His grandfather had been dead for 3 months. He'd attended the funeral, had watched them lower the coffin into the ground. Yet that voice was unmistakably his, carrying the same warm tone Jake remembered from childhood stories. "I left the journal for you to find," the voice continued, closer now. "Had to make sure you'd understand. The things we encountered in those mountains, Jake, they're not gone. They've been waiting, learning, growing stronger." Footsteps approached his hiding spot, and Jake could smell something wrong in the air. Decay mixed with antiseptic, like a hospital that had been abandoned for decades. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. "You have my eyes, boy. Always did. That's why I knew you'd be the one to continue the work. The containment protocols, they're failing. After all these years, they're finally breaking down." A hand appeared in Jake's field of vision, reaching around the radio console. The skin was pale and waxy, with fingernails that had grown too long. Jake clamped his hand over his mouth to muffle his breathing as the fingers swept through the air mere inches from his face. "The real question is," the voice said, now directly above him, "are you going to help me put things back where they belong, or are you going to make the same mistakes I did?" The hand withdrew, and Jake heard footsteps moving away from his hiding spot. He remained frozen, every muscle in his body screaming with tension as he waited to see what impossible choice he was about to face. The creature that had once been his grandfather stood motionless in the cabin's center, its borrowed flesh rippling with each labored breath. Jake pressed himself against the wall, the journal's final pages scattered at his feet like fallen leaves, each one documenting his grandfather's desperate attempts to contain what he'd brought back from the war. "You understand now," the thing wearing Thomas Brennan's face said, its voice a perfect mimicry corrupted by something ancient and hungry. "He tried so hard to keep me locked away. 65 years of imprisonment in this rotting shell." Jake's hand found the metal box his grandfather had hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a single grenade, the same type mentioned in the journal's frantic final entries. His grandfather's insurance policy, saved for when the seal finally broke. "He wrote about you," Jake whispered, his fingers working to unwrap the explosive device. "The thing they found in that bunker, the shapeshifter that killed his entire unit." The creature's borrowed eyes fixed on Jake with predatory intensity. "Killed? No, boy. I became them. Every voice, every memory, every fear, all mine now. Your grandfather was simply the strongest vessel, the one I chose for the long journey home." Through the cabin's grimy windows, Jake could see more figures emerging from the tree line. Soldiers in rotted uniforms, neighbors from town, even what looked like his own father stumbling through the undergrowth with dead eyes and jerky movements. "The seal weakened over the years," the creature continued, circling Jake like a wolf studying wounded prey. "I could send out pieces of myself, small fragments to scout and prepare. Do you think your father's car accident was really an accident, or that your mother's sudden illness was natural?" Jake's blood turned to ice. "You killed them. I studied them, learned from them, prepared them to welcome me when I finally broke free." The thing smiled with his grandfather's mouth, but the expression was all wrong, too wide and hungry. "They're waiting outside now, eager to meet the last of the bloodline." The journal had been clear about the creature's nature. It needed genetic connection to maintain its hold on human form. The Brennan bloodline was its anchor to this world, and Jake was the final link in that chain. He pulled the pin from the grenade, keeping the safety lever depressed. "Then you're going to be disappointed." The creature's stolen face contorted with rage. "You think your grandfather's crude explosive will stop me? I've survived artillery shells, fire, even his pathetic attempts to poison this body. I am eternal." "Maybe," Jake said, backing toward the cabin's rear wall. "But you need me alive, don't you? That's why you didn't just kill me when I first arrived. You need the bloodline intact to stay anchored in our world." The thing that wore his grandfather's skin began to change, flesh melting and reforming as its true nature asserted itself. Jake caught glimpses of the soldiers it had consumed, his grandfather's unit appearing and disappearing like ghosts in its shifting form. "I need your blood, boy. your memories, your connections to this place and time. The creature's voice became a chorus of the dead. But I don't need you conscious. Jake felt the rough wood of the cabin wall against his back. Behind him he could hear the shambling footsteps of the possessed villagers surrounding the building. His grandfather's final plan was becoming clear. The cabin wasn't just a prison, it was a trap designed for this exact moment. The explosive device felt heavy in his sweating palm. One wrong move and the grenade would detonate, taking him and the creature with it. But that might not be enough. According to the journal, the entity could survive the death of its host body if it had other vessels nearby. Your grandfather tried this same gambit, the creature said, reading Jake's intentions. He stood right where you're standing, holding that same weapon. But in the end, he couldn't do it. He chose imprisonment over destruction, hoping someone else would finish what he couldn't. Jake's thumb trembled on the safety lever. Through the walls, he could hear his father's voice calling his name, but the tone was wrong, hollow and lifeless. More of the creature's puppets closing in. He was weak, the thing continued, its stolen face reforming into a mockery of caring. But you're different, aren't you, Jake? You have the strength to make the hard choice. That's when Jake realized the creature's mistake. It thought he was planning to detonate the grenade here, in the cabin. But his grandfather's journal had mentioned something else. The old mine shaft behind the cabin, the one filled with dynamite from the original construction. If he could get the creature to follow him there, away from its other vessels. Jake smiled grimly and released his grip on the safety lever. The flames consumed everything with a hunger that seemed almost alive. Jake pressed himself against the cabin's outer wall, watching through the window as the crystalline formations began to crack and splinter in the heat. The alien pods writhed and blackened, their occupants' screams rising to an inhuman pitch before cutting off abruptly. Whatever his grandfather had brought back from that God-forsaken mission was finally dying. But Jake's relief was short-lived. The fire spread faster than he'd anticipated, racing across the wooden floors with predatory efficiency. Smoke poured from the broken windows, and he realized with growing horror that he might have trapped himself outside with nowhere to run. The access road was a treacherous mile through dense forest, and night was falling fast. Behind him, something rustled in the underbrush. Jake spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tree line was a wall of shadows, impenetrable in the dying light. He strained his ears, listening for any sound over the crackling flames, but heard only the wind through the pines. Still, the sensation of being watched crawled across his skin like insects. "Who's there?" he called out, immediately regretting the decision to announce his presence. The fire's glow would make him visible for hundreds of yards, while anything in the forest remained hidden. A branch snapped to his left, then another to his right. Whatever was out there, there was more than one of them. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, bears maybe, drawn by the commotion. But deep down, he knew it wasn't wildlife circling him in the darkness. The journal. His grandfather's final entry had mentioned others, fellow soldiers who'd been changed during the mission, men who'd returned home carrying the same terrible secret. What if they'd been watching the cabin all these years? What if they'd felt the disturbance when Jake had broken the seals? A figure emerged from the shadows at the forest's edge. Even in the flickering firelight, Jake could see it wasn't entirely human anymore. The man's proportions were wrong, his limbs too long, his joints bending at impossible angles. Crystalline growths jutted from his skull and shoulders, catching the light like broken glass. "You shouldn't have done that," the thing said, its voice a wet rasp that barely resembled human speech. 75 years we've been waiting for them to mature, waiting for our chance. More figures stepped from the tree line. 3, 4, 5 of them. Jake recognized one from a faded photograph in his grandfather's effects, William Chen, a young sergeant who'd supposedly died in a training accident in 1949. But here he stood, transformed into something out of nightmare, his face a map of scars and alien tissue. The old man fought it. Chen's voice echoed strangely, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. "Locked them away, locked us out. But we knew eventually someone would come. Family always comes. Jake backed against the cabin wall, feeling the heat of the flames through the logs. The fire was his only advantage now. These things, whatever they'd become, kept their distance from the burning building. But the structure wouldn't burn forever, and when it collapsed, he'd be exposed. "What do you want?" Jake managed to ask, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "What we've always wanted," the Chen Thing replied. "To go home, to bring our masters to this world. The specimens in the cabin were just the beginning, seeds waiting to be planted." "You've burned our nursery, boy. Now you'll have to replace it." Jake's hand closed around the can of gasoline he'd used to start the fire. Still half full, it wouldn't be much against 5 of these creatures, but it might buy him time. The access road was behind them, but if he could create enough chaos, maybe. The cabin's roof chose that moment to collapse, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The creatures flinched back from the eruption of flame and light, and Jake saw his chance. He hurled the gas can at the nearest figure and followed it with his grandfather's Zippo lighter. The explosion lit up the forest like daylight. The Chen Thing shrieked as flames engulfed its alien hide, stumbling backward into its companions. Jake ran, crashing through the underbrush toward where he hoped the road lay. Branches tore at his clothes and skin, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, inhuman voices rose in pursuit. He burst onto the narrow dirt road just as his lungs began to give out. His truck sat where he'd left it, keys still in the ignition. Jake dove behind the wheel and gunned the engine, tires spinning in the loose gravel as he fought to escape. In the rearview mirror, he caught a final glimpse of the cabin's death throes. The structure collapsed completely, sending a pillar of fire and smoke into the star-filled sky. But silhouetted against the flames, he could see figures moving, patient, determined, and very much alive. Jake drove through the night, knowing that burning the cabin had only been the beginning. Somewhere out there, others like his grandfather's squadmates were waiting, changed and hungry for their chance to complete a mission that had begun decades ago. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun,